Magnus Carlsen is not like us. That much we can agree on. Now, the extent to which he's not like us is of course hotly debated, or at least it should be. Is he still mostly human? Has he evolved into something other than human? Was he ever human? What role does sorcery play in what he is able to do? We may never know, but what we can do is analyze some of his play and see if we can't shed some light on exactly what's going on in that freakish head of his. I've got two incredible games for you. The first one was played only days ago on chess.com. It is a bullet game, but as usual, you'd never know it. You're going to see Magnus Carlsen checkmate the Ukrainian Grandmaster Oleksandr Bortnik in only 20 moves with the help of a beautiful combination that he's able to calculate in a mere 4 seconds. And when you see what Magnus had to see within that 4-second period of time in order to know that his combination worked, you will be able to work out, as I did, about how many moves per second Magnus is able to calculate. So this is going to be very enlightening. In our game number 2, you're going to see Magnus annihilate another heavy hitter, Grandmaster Nico Theodorou, this time using an opening that frankly looks like it's from another planet. One where they don't even play chess, as he violates just about every opening principle under our sun, but at the end of the day, the only one that matters is the rule that says rules aren't really rules unless someone is able to punish you for breaking them. Nico gives it his best college try, but the position is just too bizarre, he gets confused, and ends up resigning the game after making only 14 moves. So grab some popcorn, settle in, these ones are fun. In our first game, Magnus has Team White, and he opens with Knight to f3. Oleksandr Bortnik responds Knight to f6. We have some hyper-modern action with g3, b6, both players opting to influence the center from afar with bishop to g2 and bishop to b7. Nobody's ready to commit their central pawns just yet. We have a castling from Magnus, g6 from Oleksandr, going for bishop fianchetto number 2, and now d3. Looks a little underwhelming. The engine slightly preferred d4, but what does it know? Magnus is going for your standard King's Indian setup, supporting e4 next. Oleksandr sees what's going on, so he decides to play d5, preventing e4, as that would now just lose a pawn. Magnus says that's okay because d3 also supported c4. So however you slice it, he is getting his piece of that central pie. Best for black here is going to be to capture on c4, reopening the diagonal for his light squared bishop, giving white the choice of either recapturing with the pawn or playing queen to a4 check and then taking with his queen. But Oleksandr decides to try c6, which I gotta say looks pretty good to me. He's backing up his central pawn, ready to replace it with another pawn, but apparently white can get somewhat of an advantage by playing queen to a4, pinning that defender to the king. If black now takes on c4, well then after d takes c4, he's no longer able to trade queens, which means things are going to get a bit awkward. You got rook to d1 coming to harass the queen, who'd love to go to c7, but then there's bishop to f4. If black instead opts to maintain his pawn on d5 with something like knight b to d7, well then we have c takes d5, c takes d5, and bishop to f4, with the idea of playing a quick rook to c1, threatening an infiltration on c7. Black of course has things he can do about this, but the engine is not too impressed by any of them, so we're just going to leave it at that as we get right back to the game. Where after c6, Magnus does not play his strongest move queen to a4, but rather captures on d5. Oleksandr recaptures with the pawn, Magnus throws a knight on c3, we have bishop to g7, bishop to f4, a castling, all fairly predictable moves, rook to c1, getting on the open file, knight to c6, and now knight to e5. Why not? If you can post a well-defended piece in the center of the board, it's usually not the worst thing you can do. Oleksandr goes ahead and removes that knight. It's replaced with a bishop. Next is queen to d7, connecting the castles. Always good to have that inner kingdom communication going. Magnus develops his queen to b3, a fantastic move, now threatening to win a pawn with bishop takes f6, followed by a capture on d5, hence the defensive e6. Magnus now makes a big structural commitment with the move d4, just shutting the door on the b7 bishop, ruling out any future d4 from black to reopen its diagonal. Nothing wrong with that. The engine had other ideas though, as it so often does. It wanted knight to b5 followed by knight to c7 or knight to d4, blocking the d5 pawn that way, depending on how black responded. Next we have rook a to c8, rook to c2 from Magnus, preparing to double up on the open file. Nothing mysterious here. Oleksandr decides it's time to redeploy his bishop to a more active diagonal where it's not just staring at a friendly foot soldier, so he plays bishop to a6, and after rook f to c1 from Magnus, he follows up with the move that I'll wager the vast majority of you would see absolutely nothing wrong with. Rook to c4. Looks pretty good to me. The rook's well defended, black can double up with rook to c8 next, so just an all-around good move. Except that it's not a good move. And not only is it not a good move, it's actually a losing blunder, which Magnus now proceeds to punish like a freaking computer. If you're feeling tactically frisky, go ahead and give the video a good long pause and see if you can work out the entire winning sequence. It begins with queen to a3. Now this move was played more or less instantly, so I'm guessing that Magnus just instinctively felt that attacking the defender of the rook on c4 was going to somehow work to his advantage, and he was absolutely correct, since if black were to retreat his bishop to b7, well then he just drops a pawn on a7 with b6 under fire next. Bishop to c8 is almost too sad to talk about, but we'll do it anyway. Here white can get a crushing advantage with b3, driving the rook to c6, since that's its only safe square. And then after bishop takes f6 and bishop takes f6, white has himself a winning tactic. It's not too cosmic, but I don't want to show it to you just yet, since it's pretty much the same tactic that was played in the game. Where after queen to a3 from Magnus, Alexander decides to try queen to b7, defending his bishop. And this brings us to the critical moment of the game, where Magnus, after contemplating the position for a mere 4 seconds, does find and execute the winning combination available to white in this position. So if you want to find out just how much faster Magnus is at calculating than you are, feel free to pause the video and see how long it takes you to work it all out. And if you do, don't hesitate to let us know in the comments. I'd be curious to know your rating and how long it took you. Okay, are you ready? The winning tactical shot is knight takes d5. This is move number 1 that Magnus had to calculate. Or if you want to be technical, it would be 1/2 of a move or 1 ply, but we're just going to call it 1 move. Now, in order for Magnus to know that this works, he would have had to calculate 4 additional moves, beginning with one that was not played in the game, e takes d5, when after rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, and rook takes c4, black emerges a pawn down with a much worse position, seeing that his pawn on d5 is pinned to his queen, and therefore not free to capture the rook on c4. Okay, so 5 moves calculated so far. Let's look at what was played in the game after the sacrifice on d5, which is knight takes d5, move number 6. Bishop takes bishop makes it 7, king takes g7 makes it 8. Now this is another line that wasn't played in the game, but after rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, and rook takes c4, we're now up to 11 moves that Magnus had to see, when once again white is a pawn up with the crushing position. So in the game, after bishop takes g7, Alexander does not recapture with his king, but rather tries rook takes c2. A move that would give black a winning position, if not for the unfortunate placement of his rook on f8, which Magnus is now able to capture with his queen, giving check and mate. So after these final 2 moves, what do we have? Well, we have a total of 13 moves that Magnus would have had to see in 4 seconds in order to know that his combination was sound, which according to my 1980s math, works out to a rate of a little over 3 moves per second. Of course, there are a lot of variables to consider. He could have calculated some other line before he looked at this one. It's also possible that certain sequences of moves aren't really calculated one at a time. I mean, you could just look at a piece, see that it's twice attacked, twice defended, but one of those defending pieces is pinned, so you know you're going to win it without actually having to visualize each move being played. But this does sort of give us a rough idea of just how insanely fast Magnus is able to find and execute winning tactics. I mean, to spot queen takes f8 with mate, back when the knight was captured on d5, in a bullet game? I don't know, guys. It's almost enough to drive an aging ex-champion into a data-driven delirium of statistical psychosis, if you know what I mean. But moving on to our game number 2. In this one, Magnus Carlsen once again has control of the white walkers, and he opens with d4. His opponent, the great Nico Theodorou, responds knight to f6. We have c4 and now c5, the Benoni defense. Magnus responds with the move most preferred by the strongest humans and engines alike, d5, prioritizing space over grabbing a pawn that he's not going to be able to hang on to with d takes c5. Nico responds b5. This is known as the Benko gambit. It might look a bit odd if you've never seen it before, or even if you have, but it is quite well respected and fully engine approved. The idea being that if white takes on b5, then black's going to play a6, and if b takes a6, then he's going to recapture whenever it's most convenient, usually with his bishop, so that if white moves his e-pawn, he can take on f1, depriving him the privilege of castling on the king side. Black will typically fianchetto his other bishop on the king side, pointing it towards the queen side, where he's got the 2 half-open files, along which he can increase the pressure with his heavy pieces. So a compelling argument to be made here that black is going to have compensation for his lost pawn. So how is Magnus going to respond to this little trip down the well-trodden memory lane of opening theory? Well, he's going to lash out with an extremely unusual move, h4. Now, I couldn't find a single instance of this move ever being played at the master level in any database I have access to. And to give you an idea of just how rare it is, amongst non-titled players, it's seen in only 1 out of about 3,700 online games. Which is actually kind of surprising because it is the engine's 8th favorite move, and one that it says more or less equalizes the position. So objectively, taking on b5 is probably best, but if you want to get out of the mainline theory quick, just play h4. Doesn't even matter what the opening is, just always play h4. That's my advice. Nico now responds to this oddity with a strong move, e6, striking at that proud pawn on d5. And what do you think Magnus plays next? I think you know the move. Say its name. You got it. It's Heisenberg the h-pawn, going to h5, in flagrant violation of every opening principle imaginable, with no regard for central control or piece development or king safety. But you know what the really sick thing is? The engine thinks this is just fine. Pushing these wing pawns is the modern AlphaZero way to play, as alien as it might look to us old-timers. Nico takes the pawn on c4, and as much as Magnus would love to push his pawn to h6, establishing the dreaded thorn pawn in the black position if he were to respond with g6, or achieving an open file for his rook if the pawn is captured, he does need to take a move to deal with the attack on his d-pawn, so we do have knight to c3 defending. And after e takes d5 and the knight recaptures, we have bishop to b7, hitting that pony with the second piece. Looks pretty good for black. He's now ahead in development, and he would even have a borderline winning position if not for the move e4, now played by Magnus, sacrificing another pawn to the move played by Nico, knight takes e4, a terrible blunder. What he should have played is something like knight to c6 or bishop to e7, because now he's got this opened e-file to his king. And I know what you're saying, or what you might be saying, or what I'm saying, which is big deal, white's king is in the center too. However, after bishop takes c4, Magnus is now threatening to play queen to e2 without losing a piece to bishop takes d5, and this would be very unpleasant for black, pinning the knight to the king. The engine's recommending the immediate retreat to f6, but then you got bishop to g5 with an uncomfortable pin to the queen, and as usual, black does have some things he can try. We're probably not going to be able to fully understand why the engine thinks that they all fail, nor would we even want to, because in the game, Nico does not recognize the necessity to get his knight out of the center and instead decides to try queen to a5 check. Why not? Looks like a good move. Any piece that white blocks with can be captured by the knight on e4. So what does Magnus play? King to f1. Now if black tries to retreat his knight, queen to e2 check is a big problem. When without the queen on d8, you can no longer block with the bishop or you're just getting mated. So you got to play king to d8 when again bishop to g5 is very unpleasant. But so is bishop to d2, and somebody's getting a little short on squares. So I think your collective imaginations can probably take it from here, but let's have a look at what's tried in the game, which after king to f1 is knight to c6. Ready to meet queen to e2 with f5 defending the pinned knight, and then a blunderous f3 with knight to d4, which is actually winning for black, counterattacking the white queen. If it goes to e3, trying to maintain the pin, well, now comes bishop takes d5, and queen to a6 check. If the king goes to e1, guess who's getting forked? You could instead try throwing a knight in the way, but then guess who's still getting forked? So I don't know how much of this Magnus saw, but after knight to c6, he did have the good horse sense to play knight to f3, just defending against that knight to d4. Now this is a good and winning move, but it wasn't his best move. Apparently rook to h4 was better, attacking the knight that way, and if f5 defending, then you sack the exchange on e4 just so you can start kicking the black queen around with bishop to d2. So I don't know, Stockfish is just ridiculous. Magnus's move is comfortably winning though, even if black now castles on the queen side, which is his best move in the position. He really needs to get his king out of the center, but Nico thinks he can get away with bishop to d6. Now is he toying with the idea of going kingside? I don't know. But apparently he thinks he's okay here, since after Magnus's queen to e2, he is able to defend with f5, when because white's knight is on f3, he can no longer push a pawn there, winning the pinned knight on e4. But you know what he can do? He can play Magnus's move, bishop to d2, attacking the queen. Now, most prudent in this position would just be queen to d8, But then comes knight to g5, threatening f3, or at the very least to capture twice on e4. Castling into the c4 bishop's line of fire would not be a very wise defense. Of course, there is that knight to d4 move, hitting the white queen, but you know what the move is here? Knight takes e4, sacking the queen to knight takes e2. Because now you got knight takes bishop on d6 with check, and after king to f8, the bishop on b7 falls, and white's just grabbing way too much material. The queen does have a finite value after all. But this is not what happened in the game, where after bishop to d2, Nico decides to put his queen on a4. Okay, even my alarm bells are ringing on this one, since after Magnus's knight to c3 hitting the queen again, where exactly is it supposed to go? Maybe to c2? Negative. This loses a piece to rook to c1, forcing the queen to take on b2, after which rook to b1 will pick up the loose bishop on b7. So this was not played in the game. However, the move that is played, queen to b4, isn't any better. In fact, it's so not any better that in this position, Nico Theodoru didn't even bother to wait for Magnus's reply and went ahead and resigned the game, seeing that knight takes e4 will be winning heavy material with the discovered attack on the queen and the bishop on d6 about to fall next. So there it is, Magnus Carlsen doing what he does, playing like an alien, calculating like an engine. If you enjoyed the video, please consider a subscription to the channel if you haven't considered it already. Hit that like button to tell the algorithm what it wants to hear. Leave a comment or multiple comments with anything that's on your mind, and I will see you soon.